Well, hello and welcome to the All Saints podcast. I'm here with my good friend and your deacon, Nate Douglas. Nate, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So we wanted to give you guys an opportunity both to get to know your deacons a little bit better. I know you know Nate pretty well. Many of you know him very well, but not all of you will. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to do that. And then that'll only take a couple of minutes. And then I wanted to talk to Nate and have him talk to us about some aspects of the life and culture of the church at All Saints here in Fort Worth. The point being that, Nate, you have been here since when?
Since its founding, I've been a member since All Saints started in 2008.
Right, so way back in the beginning, you can tell us what it was like, and you've seen it grow, and you have a lovely family. You're married, 4 kids, and I want to hear not just about them, but about how they've grown up, the kind of priorities that you've sought to put in place for them as you've been raising your kids and seeking to grow close to your wife and worshiping God and working in the community and all these things. We want to hear how all those things have worked together. So give us a sketch to begin with. Tell us about your family, your wife. Maybe tell us where you met her and how that came about.
Yeah, sure. So CREC experience goes back a bit before that. I was at a previous CREC church and then went to New St. Andrews College from 2005 to 2010. I was a transfer from Patrick Henry College. Went halfway through the year. Was not smart enough to complete NSA in 3.5 years, so I did it in 4.5. And that's where I met with my wife, Leah. And we got married in 2009. We attended Trinity Reformed Presbyterian Church, pastored by the great Peter Leithart.
Right, the one and only.
The one and only.
And if you were in Moscow, interrupting you here, if you were in Moscow during those years, there must be photographic evidence of your younger self at various places along your journey. Is that right?
Don't know what you're talking
about. Yeah. I'll leave people to go and dig that up. Anyway, carry on the story. You're at NSA somewhere between 2005, 2010. You meet Leah. What happens next?
Right. So All Saints has started in 2008. By my pater familias, Elder Douglas. So I held my membership here and would come here over the summers when I wasn't at New St. Andrews College and attending Trinity. So graduate in 2010 and then immediately move here with my wife Leah. And then we have our firstborn later that summer. That summer is also when Pastor Neil arrived. So it was quite an exciting time for the church, 2010.
And so the church right back then, so Pastor Neil had arrived a couple of years after its founding.
Yes.
Of course, those of you who are at All Saints know Pastor Neil has recently led a church plant, our first church plant as a congregation here at All Saints down in Granbury. There's 100 and something people down there now, including many of our friends, 1 or 2 new faces. And that's going great. And here as we record in May 2024, it's Pastor Shaw and myself here with 300 and something people in the congregation, and like last week we had pushing 400, I think, squeezed into the fellowship hall and the sanctuary. But you knew the church when it was what? How many people was it right at the beginning?
We started with 4 families, so yeah, it was just 3 others. So been here the entire every step of the journey.
And for the sake of people who don't know, have you always met? Has All Saints always met in this building, or what was the story before that?
Yeah, so when we first started worshiping here, it was in the afternoons. Arlington Heights Christian Church owned the building at that time, and so we worshiped at 1 o'clock. It's the perfect time to worship when you have little people that need that nap in that kind of mid-afternoon circadian rhythm. I'm being very facetious for anyone listening and not looking at my face.
Yeah, right.
So we did that for 10 years, worshiping at 1 o'clock in the afternoons. And during that 10 years, as our church was growing, we were able to manage the building ourselves. Arlington Heights gave us the building because of our growth and size and just our ability to manage and take care of the facilities.
Right.
So that was a great blessing for us. And then starting in 2020, we were able to start worshiping in the mornings, and that's obviously when you joined us.
Showed up December 2020. And I should say, just parenthetically, I mean, that relationship with Arlington Heights Christian Church, I don't know many of their congregation very well, but I know some of their congregation a little bit, and it has been a remarkable blessing to us, obviously, with this building, but just behind the scenes, the grace and the kindness shown by a small congregation that could very easily just have sold this building, taken a large sum of money, gone and bought themselves a smaller building somewhere else, but instead chose, for the sake of the gospel, to share their building and to give their building to a congregation like ours, which, though obviously all Christians, we do have some different doctrinal distinctives, it's an interesting cameo of Christian love and faithfulness to Christ and mutual service. And it's just worth saying, for the sake of all the members of All Saints and anybody who visits us on a Sunday in this wonderful building, this was a gift from a little congregation that didn't need to give it to us, but because of the kindness of Christ working in and through them, they did. And here we are with this magnificent infrastructure right in the heart of Fort Worth.
Yeah, it's definitely by God's grace. Obviously, He's the great storyteller, so we're very thankful for that. And they're very gracious in giving this to us, seeing the need, and at the same time, under the leadership of Pastor Neil, Elder Douglas, and eventually Elder Capone, they being gracious stewards and really caring for that relationship. Obviously, if we were not good guests in our early years and that eventually hosts, that relationship would not work very well.
Well, and they have a space still. We keep alive a space and some office space as well. A space for worship and some office space for them. And occasionally they come back in, and I occasionally see their office at their pastor or other members of the church.
Sure.
So what's happened then over that time? Your kids have all been born, baptized, and raised in All Saints. And so given the centrality and significance of faithful Christian family life, I would love to hear you talk about some of the things that you've sought to give your kids and share with them, and that you've been able to give them and share with them as a member here at All Saints. So just introduce your kids to us first. Tell us their names and how old they are, and then perhaps you could talk through some of the priorities you've had as a father and as a husband for your children.
Sure. So 4 children. Oldest is Andy. He's 13 years old. And then there's Kirsty. She just turned 12. Ella is 9. And then Bruce is going to turn 6 later this month. So very thankful for them. They are sanctifying and lovely and a joy to be around in many ways. So ever since Leah and I are second generation Reformed Christian, raised where parents are definitely intended for us to receive the best education possible. So when my parents were raising me, I'm the oldest of 15 children. All of us were homeschooled, and at the time, over 35 years ago, being homeschooled was not quite as commonplace as it is now.
Yeah, a little weird.
Yes, a little weird. Much less in the way of resources available. Obviously, a good portion of that time there wasn't even really the internet. So it was a much greater sacrifice on their part, kind of wading out into the wilderness in the frontier and trying to figure out how do we do this whole homeschool thing. There was no template, there was no book at that time. And then on the other hand, my wife Leah was also among kind of the first wave of classically educated students. So her father started one of the first classical schools in the Pacific Northwest. And so she had that distinct education as well. So kind of with those two combined, homeschooled and classically educated backgrounds for both Leah and I, we definitely wanted to share and kind of level up the education we were given and provide that to our children.
Well, let's just talk about that then, because there's a bunch of stuff I want to hear you talk about in relation to how worship and church life and fellowship feature into your kids' lives. But you've just raised their homeschooling that you had, the classical Christian education in a school environment that Leah had, and regular listeners to the podcast will know that this is something we've talked about a little bit before, and we don't need to go into all the kind of basic ABCs, but it will be really interesting to hear your take on how the different flavors of education you've been able to give your kids have had their strengths and weaknesses, and how you've sought to shore those up and improve and optimize for your family over the years.
Yeah, sure. So we've enrolled our children in a classical school full time for a couple of years. That certainly has some strengths, like
you can tell us the name of that school, by the way, right?
Yeah, great. Grace Classical Christian School in Granbury.
All right, gotcha.
A lot of great, fantastic families there. Anyone in the Granbury area, of course, would highly recommend that school. Yeah. Some members of All Saints teach there, as well as at our church plant, CCG in Granbury with Pastor Neil. So we attended there for a couple years, then decided to homeschool and pivot. Did that for a year, and then started the Oaks with the Brants in 2020. So we really have been pleased and blessed by the fruit we've seen with the Oaks tutorials here at All Saints. It's we think it's the happy medium of providing the strengths of homeschooling. Homeschooling requires parental involvement, whereas enrolling your children at a 5-day-a-week school, it can easily lend to the temptation of you drop your kids off at school and here, go educate my kids and then go pick them up.
Right, yeah. You just outsourced the education of your kids.
Right, and obviously there are some parents that can do that and still be incredibly involved with their children's
Right,
lives and
right.
do that extremely well. So I don't want to.
But there
knock
is that
model.
temptation, right?
It is a temptation.
Every model you choose is going to have its distinctive ways it could backfire, and that's how a schooling model can work.
Indeed.
Wrong, yeah.
And so, on the other hand, kind of the other end of the ditch, if you will, if we want to take it to extremes, homeschooling can be very autonomous at times as far as what the parents want to do week to week, month to month, and what the children take with what their parents are giving them. Obviously, that can be done well if, again, the parents are engaged, involved, and are providing structure and discipline, but that's really hard, and your parents have to be very engaged to do that. And if you have a lot of younger children running around the place, that could be very tricky.
Yeah.
So the Oaks we found to be a very effective medium to kind of balance both of those methodologies. I'm certainly dogmatic about what I think classical education, how important that is, the benefits of it. I would definitely recommend it over a non-classical education.
Right. And that's a structural question that we've talked about in other contexts. Maybe we'll come back to that because there's a bunch of deep dives we could do. But we had Tyler Bauer on a couple of weeks ago talking about that. And so
That's great.
If regular listeners go back and listen to my conversation with Mr. soon-to-be Dr. Bauer talking about that issue, that's good. Anyway, sorry, go on.
Right. So we found the Oaks provides that balance of giving parents the parental involvement at home that they need 3 days of the week, but the other 2 days we're providing them a rigorous structure and discipline in order to deliver that education. Certainly an advocate for the classical method because of the richness of it. Having scripture at the center of it, the preeminent classical text, is incredibly important. And teaching children in a time where more than ever entities and media outlets are competing for eyeballs, views, and clicks, all for zeitgeisty, temporal things, being grounded in things that are good and that last is more important than ever.
Well, and just parenthetically, before we jump away from this subject, occasionally people ask, what is the relationship between the Oaks tutorials and All Saints? And perhaps as one of the pastors here, it would be helpful if I just flesh that out, just lest anybody be in any doubt. The Oaks tutorials is a 2-day-a-week classical Christian school that meets in the building here at All Saints, but has no formal governmental relationship with us. We want to support them as much as we possibly can, and to that end, we've allowed the Oaks to use our building. Over the years, they've made contributions to the financial costs involved, but certainly in the early days, we wanted to do this to the extent that come use a building, it's not being used. The Oaks tutorials have invested in the building and at the same time received the benefit of the infrastructure and so on. There's been that happy two-way street. Pastor Shaw recently and I for several years have taught the Oaks tutorials, taught Bible and theology, which is it's been a blast. There've been the usual ups and downs that every teacher will be familiar with, but that, to my mind, that doesn't sully the experience at all. And it's just been a really exciting time and a pleasure to be a part of it. And so, in terms of how I, as a pastor here at All Saints, think of the Oaks, this is exactly the kind of educational structure that I want to encourage parents to consider for their children. It may well be that there are alternatives that work better for you, and every parent has got to figure out, or parents have got to figure out, what's the best we can do for our kids. But at the very least, reflecting on the strengths of this kind of hybrid model, it gives a good baseline for thinking about what's going to be good for your children, right? I mean, because if there are areas where this is at a significant advantage, it's at least worth then considering those things.
Certainly. So there's a couple points to that. Definitely appreciative of our relationship with All Saints and you and Pastor Shaw's involvement. This building has been an amazing tool to essentially minister to our community through the
Right,
Oaks.
right,
So
right.
we have well over 100 students in just our 4th year, and we have over 30 different churches in our extended community represented. And that's fantastic to have that diversity of the body, diversity of the body where students are interacting with each other from different backgrounds, as well as different churches and have slightly different theologies, and that's great and that's okay. I'm excited that a lot of those students are getting a distinctive Bible and theology teaching from you and Pastor Shaw.
We do what we can. Yeah.
So that's kind of a side bonus that I like.
Yeah.
But it's also this communal involvement, going back to your original question, that is what Leah and I wanted for our children. So a lot of analysis and studies have been done just on the communal involvement with children and how well children do when they have multiple good, strong kind of other parental figures involved in their lives. And so for our children, we love that our children come here. It's their church, but it's also their school. And to have that overlap is huge, both from just it being the same place to they regularly seeing a lot of the same people. I mean, if they were to meet you in the hall, it's like, oh, it's my it's my Bible teacher. No, he's also my pastor.
My pastor as well. Yeah.
Right. And so you have this community involvement where they see other people from their church from on Sundays, but they also see them on Mondays and Thursdays.
Yeah.
So that's to be able to have that community and that culture and have that significant kind of overlap is something we definitely felt strongly about in providing for our children as well.
And that's something I think it's worth picking up on because, in a sense, that is one particular microcosmic instantiation of this broader issue of you have your children, and it's not the case that it takes a village to raise a child in the sense of how that rhetoric is sometimes used to displace the role of parents and the village becomes the state, right?
Right.
That's not what we're talking about. But actually to have a community of other parents at church, other parents whom you know who are also raising kids of, not necessarily the identical age, but also they've got the same convictions and they're trying to do the same kinds of things. It produces a sort of roundedness to a child's experience and their relational capacities that I think is really precious. And just for ourselves, we were homeschooling in England, where it's still weird, right? And I'll tell you that we were confronted before we started with a number of objections from concerned friends and family members, and the common one was the socialization objection. It's like, what's going to happen if your kids don't know how to relate to other people because they're just stuck at home all day? I'm not here patting my own back. I think God has been very kind, and I think the way he's been kind is by using the social structures that he's created in the world. I think our kids came to be more socially at ease in many different environments, including with their peers, than other kids whom we knew in England who'd gone to schools where they're surrounded every day by 26 exact contemporaries plus a teacher.
Right.
And I don't, like I said, this is not me saying we did such a great job. What I think we did realize by the grace of God is that he has designed communities that are designed to function well. It's the village in the sense not of, like I said, how that rhetoric is sometimes deployed, but it's the community of the church with all the different ages of people and people from different family backgrounds. In London, from very different backgrounds. In Fort Worth, there's still a good deal of diversity culturally and so on. That kind of experience of life is valuable and shapes our children. And you must have seen that in your kids as they've been growing up in the last 13 years or so at All Saints.
Yes, seen that. And for some of the families that they've come to know at All Saints that preceded the Oaks, and then for those relationships to continue in a much deeper manner at the Oaks, has been magnificent to watch. And now just people that they would have thought as parents 5 years ago at church, they have now had as teachers. And they now have a much more deeper relationship, and those teachers have shaped them much more deeply in turn, which is something we definitely appreciate, again, this overlap of community that has been developing here at All Saints.
Right. Now that makes me want to take this conversation in two directions, and one I think we should save for another day, and it's the issue of discipline of children, because obviously the thought of bringing kids into any kind of public environment is, for some parents, a slightly intimidating thought. They bring their kids to church on Sunday morning with a bit of a kind of flutter in their heartstrings or whatever, because they're thinking, oh man, how's little Johnny going to behave today?
Right.
Now, there's a bunch of questions there about how Christian parents, can most fruitfully disciple their own kids. Now, let's park that question, because I think that will probably take us a couple of hours if we if we go down that route, and we should probably get a mum in here as well as a dad to talk about that.
Indeed.
But let's talk about the second direction I think would be helpful to take this, which is from the growth of a Christian family towards the cultivation of a culture that extends beyond your family in the church. I know this is a very diffuse question as I'm posing it, but pick it up and take it in whichever direction you want. What are some of the things that you've been encouraged by or have wanted to see in your children's lives as they've grown up into a broader social setting within the church, and not just your kids, but also yourself and Leah? I guess I'm asking you a question of how your family has integrated with the culture of the church community, and what you see the strengths are of that, and maybe weaknesses if there are things that we need to work on.
Sure. Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah, deliberately open-ended.
Very open-ended and broad.
Feel free just to throw any thoughts on the table.
Sure. So for Leah and I, having had the background that we've had, all, again, thanks to the grace of God and the work and sacrifice that our parents put in, definitely a need and desire to share and provide other opportunities for families at our church, in a more of a leadership role, obviously. So we have families that have been coming to All Saints that are even relatively new to the faith, have no idea about many theological components and distinctives about why we do things the way we do them, much less education. They have super young children. They're figuring all of this out. Some didn't have great parental relationships, and subsequently were not told or taught how to deliver that for their children as well. So it's certainly puts the impetus on the families like us. There are others who are even better at this than Lee and I, that have been doing it far longer, that have a lot of knowledge and wisdom to share with our younger families. And so as those opportunities have been presented to Lee and I, we've tried to share those with kind of our newer families. So that's been one way.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I think it's one of the wonderful things about a church like All Saints, but also one of the challenges, is to realize that it's not just that people come here and they're in different places, but they've come from radically different directions.
Yes.
So the danger is that sometimes we imagine that everyone who arrives at a certain ecclesial locale, they're in the same kind of church community, and then they think, well, maybe I want to join this church. Right. They've all got the same convictions, and they've all come from the same place. And it's just not true. I mean, they like you said, some people are moving here and they come from other CREC churches, and their father and grandfather and great-grandfather were pastors. Other people are coming from family backgrounds that are more fractured, parents whom they love and who love them, but who by their own admission have struggled to provide the kind of stability and certainly the Christian influence that all of us would like to pass on to our kids.
Right.
So one of the things I'm really excited to see, and this is a major reason for wanting to have you share these thoughts, is none of us who've been Christian parents for any length of time are wanting to hold ourselves up as some kind of perfect template. But the simple truth is, we've made a bunch of mistakes. We've avoided some mistakes. We'd love to help other folks to avoid some of the mistakes that we made and to benefit from some of the lessons that we've learned. And it's striking, the things that you've talked about your children's education. That's a large piece of it, I think. Just realizing the options that are available, and that none of them works without a high level of parental involvement, a high level of parental commitment. I was talking to a parent just yesterday, actually. I was talking to a mum briefly before worship, and I found myself trying to articulate what it is that a mum and a dad can do for their children if their children are going into an environment like the Oaks or like another school. And one of the things I said, and I've observed this as a teacher, is if you're able to provide a stable, distraction-free, calm study environment at home for your kids, I cannot tell you how valuable that is. Mm-hmm. And speaking as a teacher, I think I can guess with a fair degree of certainty which of my Bible and theology students have been provided with such an environment and which have not.
Yes.
And you can tell from the consistency of the homework they produce, not necessarily from the academic points they're scoring, but from the effort they're putting into it. You can tell from how tired they are or aren't when they come to class. You can tell from how regular their homework is. You can tell from how they respond when they know they're going to be away. I've had one young man his family aren't at All Saints. He's been in my class for 2 or 3 years now, and he's had to be away for various issues, medical issues and family travel. And every single time his mum is say, "Hey, this young man, my son isn't going to be there these couple of weeks. How can we keep up with the homework? How can we keep up with?" Now, none of that happens. None of it happens without a high level of intentional, self-conscious planning and organisation on behalf of parents, and especially mums. I think we can't hide this. So just to say, all that is to say, there are these connections between the creation of something as simple as 4 square feet of space in which to do your homework,
right,
without TV screens, without phones, without music playing, without interruptions.
Mm-hmm.
Between that and somebody's educational outcomes 10 years down the track, and the moral outcomes, let's put it as crudely as that a child is learning to be disciplined, learning to focus on the thing they've been given, learning to do the work they've been told to do, even when, oh man, this English is hard, or this math is difficult, or this theology paper is really long. They learn to do it. And it turns out that those skills are what are needed in the workplace.
Yes.
And so there's this symbiotic relationship between high level of parental investment in their children,
right,
and the outcomes that you see. And it turns out then that those kids are able to engage in class, able to talk to their friends, able to talk to other adults as well, and so on and so forth.
Yes. So I think the example you just used is a great microcosm to show that the importance of liturgy. So
right,
we're liturgical people. We can have good liturgies or we can have bad liturgies, right? A bad liturgical family could be a family who's homeschooling very kind of haphazardly. As the day goes, so does the homeschooling, and the week is kind of not really planned, or the month is not really planned. It doesn't even have to be just about education, though. It could be about how chores are assigned, when you're supposed to brush your teeth, how meals are prepared, when you do family worship. If all of those things aren't at a regular cadence, then, the liturgy is all over the place and it changes day to day. You could have a bit more of a liturgical family whom is a bit more structured than that, but the structure isn't a very good one. So a family is always showing up to church 5 to 10 minutes late. That's consistent liturgy, but it's still a bad one.
Yes, consistently
right?
wrong. Yeah.
Yes, and so that's typically a symptom of other things, obviously. So what we've found to be very helpful, and I say all this with the huge caveat with big blinking lights, that Lee and I are not by any means perfect at this as well, but it's certainly been helpful than not doing it at all, and that is setting routine liturgical cadence at the home. So our children have a general idea of what they're supposed to do when they wake up, when they're supposed to wake up, when they prepare breakfast. For our children that drink tea, they know they're supposed to prepare their tea at a certain time. When they're supposed to do their chores, what chores they have, when they're supposed to do them, when they're supposed to start doing their homework, the priority and order in which they're supposed to do their homework, when they can take their breaks, when they can expect lunch, all the way to any afternoon activities, free time, family worship, what we do in family worship. That's during the day. During the week, when they can expect to probably stay up a bit later and watch the Rangers or the Mavs or the Stars, or maybe get a Friday night movie in.
Night or whatever.
Yeah, they know Friday or Saturday night's typically going to be homemade pizza night.
Mm-hmm.
Sunday has a very particular flow. So having all of those structures and expectations in place, we have found to be incredibly helpful in raising the children. It helps them to be more self-disciplined.
Yes.
Not to say that they are lacking in self-discipline. But I shudder to imagine what they would be like if it weren't for this.
Yes.
Because we can see where they slide or fade when Leah and I are not good at keeping the liturgies at home consistent.
It's striking because the way you describe this, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of somebody who's hearing this idea for the first time, maybe a parent of very young children who's just starting to process this question of how are we going to do life when little Jimmy or little Jenny needs to learn to read or whatever.
Sure.
And you've described the kind of structured approach to life, which at a superficial glance could easily sound like stultifying and constraining. And yeah. I can tell you, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. When we started homeschooling, what you've described is more or less exactly what Nicole drew up. And I say Nicole, she actually drew up the details. Obviously, we talked about how are we going to do this homeschooling thing, but she was the one who was implementing most of it. And she is an organized person and instinctively brought that to bear. And again, by God's grace, here we are stumbling with some good guidance from other resources into a pattern of life which is really valuable. And one of the reasons it's so valuable is that paradoxically it creates freedom.
Yes.
Because here's what happens. If you don't have structure, then kids will tend to do one of two things, normally one after the other. First, they'll use their time inefficiently. They'll meander around. If there's no constraints on their time, let's say, simplify for the sake of just clarity, there's no structure during the day. So during the morning and the early part of the afternoon, they're kind of meandering around, not really doing much of, and lots of little things, but not really focusing on any one thing necessarily. Or maybe they are focusing on one thing, but it's not a productive thing which is moving the ball down the field in a purposeful direction.
Yes. Then
inevitably what's going to happen is that structure will be imposed from somewhere. It might be imposed because, hey, you've got to get your homework in for the Oaks tutorials or for Covenant Classical or whatever next Wednesday. It might be imposed because mum says you've got to finish your math homework. But it might be imposed 10 years down the track when you're looking for a job.
Yes.
Or 15 years down the track when you're looking for higher education opportunities, or whatever stage you're at. At some point, the requirement for disciplined, productive adherence to structure is going to manifest itself. And at that point, you get enslaved. You're constrained, and you're constrained in a way which means you can't be productive.
Right.
So you either have what looks like happy chaos, which isn't really happy in the long run and isn't so fruitful, and then leads to rushed, hectic feeling of being overwhelmed. Or what you do is you put the structure in place and you get the things done that need to be done, and you'd be amazed. I know you wouldn't be amazed, but many people would be amazed by how much it's possible for young children with diligent parents to accomplish in a morning.
Yes.
You've 3 or 4 different lessons of 45 minutes in length or an hour in length.
Right.
And they get through loads of things. And when they're young, you have a decent morning, you have lunch, you have a couple of hours in the afternoon, it gets to 3 o'clock. It's like, well, now you can spend an hour or two doing whatever you like to do. And you've taught your child a really valuable lesson there of, get your work done.
Yes.
And then you've generated time for leisure, for pursuits that you really want to engage in and indulge in.
Yes, and then to make that clear, if anyone were to come drop in on our house, we're not a tightly oiled machine, Captain Von Trapp kind of everything is managed to the T and everyone is filing in at a certain time in full uniform. I mixed probably 2 or 3 different metaphors there. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
But having that structure provides, in a way, guardrails to where we call audibles all the time. We have to change the play. This one child is being a major stinker about this particular homework thing that's taking up way more time than it should have. But we do have those guardrails in place where other children still have the expectation of knowing what they need to do, or we have time and availability to spend that extra time with that person if they need it. And so having that structure and setting those expectations and responsibilities and making those clear, like you said, is incredibly important down the road when they get to the workplace. That's something I've been talking about a lot with our oldest. Hey, if you are faithful in these little things here, you're going to stand out really fast when you start to grow up and are working with your peers out in the world.
Yeah. That strikes me then as a good point to jump off in another direction. You mentioned liturgy in relation to family life and structure. Mm-hmm. How have you found your kids' participation in the church's liturgy? Just for the sake of people who may not know All Saints well, we have a fairly structured, I want to say formal, but that could give a mistaken impression that it's not supposed to be sullen or uninvolved, but it's a kind of structured form of worship, which will be very familiar to regulars and members at All Saints. And one of the questions that frequently comes in here from parents whose children are not used to that form of worship is, yeah, my kid can't sit through that, or what about the children? It's not very engaging for the children.
Right.
I know that to be a myth.
Yes.
I'd love to hear your experience on this, though, as a father of 4 kids.
Sure. So being at All Saints and having the children the ages they are, so they have all grown up here. They've been in this environment that anyone listening to this is seeing firsthand. All have been baptized by Pastor Neil. And like you said, it's a myth that many components of our liturgy have no bearing on the children's. Great example is seeing Shiloh and Annika Gill sitting in front of us and their daughter, whose name I've already forgotten. I'm sorry. But right when Sophia is banging out the first chord of the doxology,
her little hands go up.
Her little hands go up. She knows what's coming, and that comes with training. Obviously, the Gills are doing well at home. I would imagine they probably sing that or play that in their family worship. But even if they don't, and it's just the church liturgy that's having that effect on her, that's a classic and easy example right there.
Yeah.
It's great to see the liturgy being as intentional as it is, and anyone that isn't quite sure about that intentionality, definitely read the Lord's Service by Jeff Myers.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that's a great book.
Yes.
Yeah.
And to see our children interact with that as far as being called, being cleansed, the importance of seeking repentance and reconciliation. There's a cadence and order to our liturgy that is very much reflective in everyday life as well. So we can't proceed with certain relationships without making things right first.
Yeah.
And so seeing our children interact with those components of our liturgy has been incredibly helpful as well. Yeah. Ending the day with a feast. Celebrating just like we do at the end of the day. So we've completed our work. Now let's sit down, have a good, proper meal.
Yes.
We'll play some excellent music, drink good drinks, eat good food.
Mm-hmm.
It's very
I like it. And one of the things that's really striking about that to me is having each of the parts in those relationships to each other within a church liturgy. It doesn't detract from, let's say, the ministry of the word, the reading and preaching of the word of God, to say that the Lord's Supper is the climax of the worship service.
Right.
I remember the first time I heard this is going back way 20 years or so, when I was in a Calvinist evangelical church at the time, yes. that as a very, very junior staff member, and the church made very little of. Actually, no, it's more than 20 years, nearly 25 years. The church made very little of the Lord's Supper.
Right.
And I remember hearing somebody talk about in another context, so the Lord's Supper is the climax of our worship. I remember thinking, yeah, but doesn't that downgrade the word? Isn't the word supposed to be significant?
Right.
And it's like, no, you're not seeing it. I now realize, and realize very quickly, of course,
Sure.
that as soon as you start thinking about it, you elevate the significance of the word read and preached by placing it in its proper relation to the celebration meal at the end of our worship.
Mm-hmm.
Just as, and this is a fascinating kind of semi-parallel, if you're saying to your children during the day, during their work day, we're going to have it's Friday night, we're going to have special dinner, pizza on the sofa, and watch a movie when Dad comes home from work.
Right.
Keep going with your work now. Come on, get your schoolwork done so that you don't have to be doing your schoolwork this evening.
Mm-hmm.
What you do is you intensify their focus on the schoolwork precisely by placing it in a proper kind of synthetic relation to what's coming at the end of the day, the climax, the meal, the fellowship time with your family. And so everything is improved experientially by seeing things in their proper relation to each other.
Yes, and it would feel weird or awkward if any of those were missing,
Right.
or if any of those were put in a different place.
In a different place, yeah. I wanted to take half a step back and just to try and frame the things we've been talking about in more, I'm tempted to say sort of theological categories, because the way that you're speaking about your family's life, in effect, what it seems to me you're giving us a picture of is the growth of the kingdom, or the progress of eschatology within a family, church, community nexus. And what's really fascinating about this, I think, is that for many of us, as soon as I start talking about eschatology, okay, initially people will think in theological terms about the end times.
Right.
Then they realize, no, what we're actually talking about is a philosophy of history. We're talking about the kingdom spreading gradually throughout the world.
Yes.
As the gospel spreads, the gospel permeates society, so that with ups and downs, we're expecting to see the growth of Christian influence over many, many, many generations, for 1,000 generations of those who love me, until the end when Christ returns. And so we're in the middle of this progress period, where Christ is extending his scepter to the nations, crushing his enemies under his feet, welcoming his people to him, and increasing in his kingdom is growing in size and influence. Now, as soon as we start framing things in that way, the temptation for me, and I think for lots of people, is to see all the darkness out there that hasn't been reached.
Right.
And we're sort of howling at the moon in frustration and disappointment and sorrow and grief for the people who don't know Christ and who we wish did and knew and were experiencing the kindness and grace of his reign and his presence in their lives.
Yes.
But to insert the picture of family life you've described within that eschatological picture, I think is profoundly important, because what it does is to say, first, here's something that you can control within limits, or let's frame it more precisely. Here is something that you do have some control and influence over, certainly more control and influence over than what's going on out there.
Right.
But second, it is actually the presence of the kingdom of Christ. It's not the aspiration to it. When you have your kids who are growing up year by year and growing in their love for each other, with all the usual bumps in the road, being discipled, being disciplined, learning to love each other, building relationships within the church family, learning to worship God formally, learning to worship God in their lives. They're growing in knowledge through their schooling. They're growing in years, and believe me, those 18 years disappear pretty fast. That is the presence of the kingdom of Christ in our families, and therefore it is the presence of the kingdom of Christ in the world. It is a more immediate, tangible, almost visceral experience of the goodness of God. And I so wish that it was possible for us to keep that picture firmly and clearly within our minds, because we do our families harm to the extent that we don't devote the intensity of our thought and energy and time to them. And we do little good, because truth is, there's not as much that we can do about the chaos in the world out there as there is that we can do about the little precious olive shoots that the Lord has placed around our tables.
Right.
You have thoughts about that?
Oh, many.
We have all day. Well,
Until
all day.
12
Yeah.
or whatever we're deciding to want to cut off. Yeah, it's very easy to be an impatient postmillennialist.
Right.
It's very easy to howl at the moon, to scream at the void, to yell at the chaos and the darkness and be frustrated with it, to yell at the darkness and be all like, "Hey, why are you being so dark and evil?" Like you would have any expectation that it would be otherwise, right? It doesn't know any better, so it's a fruitless exercise to yell at the pagan nations and say, "Hey, why are you so pagan?" Well, of course they are. They're pagan nations, which is why the psalmist says, "Oh, pagan Nathan, why do the heathen nations
Rage and
rage in
the
vain?"
people's plot in vain. It's asked as a
Right.
question, isn't it? It's like
It answers
bewildered.
it answers the question in the question. It's in vain.
Yes.
So why obsess over it? Instead, focus on the little things that you're called to be faithful for, that God has put in front of you. If you obsess over those things, obviously it's not good for your own spiritual health, but you're teaching your children to let external factors and things outside of their control frustrate them or beguile them as well, and that's not healthy way to raise them. And this is what I've really appreciated by the culture that Pastor Neil has established here, and obviously you and Jeff Shaw are continuing, our elders as well, Tony and Jean, very much focused on being faithful in the little things, not at all being worried about or letting external factors kind of wag the dog, if you will. So frequently over the last 10 years or 15 years, I've been asked, "Hey, where do you go to church?" "Oh, I go to All Saints Presbyterian Church, CRC Church in Fort Worth." "Oh, yeah, who's the pastor there?" For a majority of that time, it's been Pastor Neil, right? And almost every time I'll be asked, "Oh, Pastor Neil, who's that?" I'm like, well, that's the point,
Yeah,
right?
that's interesting.
He's one of the longest tenured pastors in the CREC.
He's been around since before the CREC was even the CREC.
Right. And he's definitely, if you know, pastor. So those that do know him have nothing but amazing things to say about him because of his faithfulness and his love for his flocks. But it's also that dedication that he's otherwise not known to many others because that's all he's really been focusing on, right?
Yes.
He's not done things to garner a bad name for himself or put himself out there in a way where he would gain notoriety for good or bad reasons or otherwise. He's just a faithful servant taking care of his congregation. It's very much in line with your sermon from a couple weeks ago on why have a pastor with a social media presence? And Pastor Neil's a great antithesis of that. And so that, and same with our elders, it matriculates down to the congregation and the culture we have, I think, of being focused on and faithful in the little things that God has set before us, being patient and knowing that the story is already written.
Yes.
We just have to play our part with the little things that have been set before us.
Yeah.
I really like this George Eliot quote.
Yeah, you emailed that to me. Go and read it.
I didn't know if I'd be able to work it in or not, but you kind of put it on a tee, and so I'm going to try to take a swing for the fences. She says, "The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and the things that are not so ill with you and me as they might have been. Is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs." And I think that
Fascinating.
reflects the kind of the culture and what we want for All Saints and how it's progressed thus far.
You know, I think I've tried to reflect on this to try and understand as well as I can the psychological and emotional driving forces that are at work here. What makes it hard to do that? And I think you're right. Partly it's the impatience thing, and it's a holy impatience. This is the thing that makes it difficult. It is a holy and admirable restlessness with things not being as they ought to be. But the difficulty is, right at that point, what do you do? And the temptation is to turn aside from the precisely the means that God has given us to address that the world is not how it's supposed to be, character that we see around us. And I can only think that the devil celebrates every single time he sees that, because he sees a minor victory when wives and husbands, or mums and dads, turn aside from devoting themselves to the long-term fruitfulness of their children's lives. I do think it is well-intentioned. This is the
Sure.
but it's well-intentioned unproductivity, and in a sense it comes from a foreshortened eschatological time frame. A sense that things ought to happen quicker than they are.
Again, the impatient postmillennialist.
Right. What's intriguing to me is coming from the UK, where among Reformed and Calvinist evangelicals, amill eschatology is very, very common, actually, as it is in some parts of the Presbyterian world in the US.
Sure. Yeah.
Back to the education point, when we started talking about educating our kids at home, because we wanted to give them a Christian upbringing, the response we got from our Christian friends was, what about evangelism?
Right.
Now, what's going on there? It's fascinating. It's the well-intentioned desire to see the world changed on a time scale that is not necessarily the Lord's time scale, and certainly by a means that is not the Lord's appointed means. So what I wanted to say to them was, and I did say this to friends multiple times, I promise you, I believe in the importance of evangelism. I spend hours every week in London on the streets doing street evangelism, knocking on doors, sitting in coffee shops, evangelizing unbelievers. I believe in that.
Right.
And what I'm doing with my children, what we're striving to do as parents with our children, is to make them into better evangelists.
Yes.
And their grandchildren and their grandchildren's great-grandchildren for however many generations. And the difficulty was that we couldn't get our Christian friends to see it. And the reason I'm convinced is that the eschatological necessity of to 1,000 generations had not sunk in. In this case, I was talking with theologically amill, mostly trainee pastors.
Right.
And what happened, you just get through the conversation, and then they'd realize, we're like, oh, okay, but you're saying that because you're post-mill.
Right.
And I'm like, yeah, you're getting it now. Like, yeah, but I'm not post-mill. I think Jesus could return at any time. I think there's this kind of urgency, which I would describe as a kind of impatience in the way you're describing it. There's this kind of urgency animating their desire. So they're actually willing to, I don't want to be pejorative, but I think I'd have to put it like this, sacrifice their children's Christian upbringing for the sake of the kingdom. They would use that phrase, for the sake of the kingdom, so you can evangelize at the school gate. And I think that's one of my head in my hands moments.
Sure.
And it is a crying shame and a deep irony to see a mirror of that among theologically post-mill people.
Yes.
Like, that we should be distracted from those things which the Lord has given to us, those things being our children,
Right.
For those of us who have children. And even for those of us who don't, our life in a worshipping community and our faithfulness within that context. Distracted from those things to the ephemeral promise of a quick fix now,
Right.
is deeply ironic. And we, of all people, ought to be able to resist that on theological grounds.
Yes.
And to be able to say, look, let me just do my job as a dad, and let me disappear into obscurity, so that in 10 generations nobody can even remember my name, if only the Lord fulfills his promises to be God to my children and my children's children.
Yes. And to be clear, and I don't think anybody else would get this impression, especially if they listened to your sermon a couple of weeks ago, but we're not advocating for apathetic evangelism either, and shove evangelism, right? Just listen to your sermon from 2 weeks ago. But a great example of how you can still minister to that was kind of just that very day after you preached that. I had neighbors moving in next door that I had met previously as they were getting the house ready, and they were moving in right after we returned from church. And so, of course, I want to pop over and see how things are going. And I made the distinct and intentional decision of, I'm going to make sure I'm going over there with beer and still in my church clothes and not going to go run and change into my t-shirt and shorts real quick. And take opportunities like that to make very clear, yes, we're Christians. We go to church, and just start sowing the seeds to see what the Lord does with them. Now, there's lots of different ways where you can still develop relationships with other people without proselytizing overtly, but it's that slow relationship building that really does help win people over. And that's, again, what I think is unique and special about All Saints. So we've had some families come over from the Oaks, for example, to start attending All Saints regularly. We've had even 2 join over the last month. And it's been refreshing to see that they've wanted to come to All Saints because of the relationships, the flavor, and the culture. It's great to have people that come to the Fort Worth area from another CRC church or someone from another denomination that suddenly felt compelled to give their children Paedo communion. They have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. I got to find a congregation that practices Paedo communion, right? I mean, that's great and that's wonderful. But it's been also lovely to see families coming to the church, and they are coming because of the culture, the flavor, the feel of the church, the friendliness of it, the relationships, the liturgical flow, even though they might not quite understand it or give a theological distinctive for it or reason for it, that it feels right to them.
Yes.
And it's, I mean, like your Sunday sermon yesterday, it's the kind of culture that I hope for and think that if we had a Rosaria Butterfield come in, they would see that and it would win them over. So it's going back to the original question of, we're not saying shove evangelism.
No.
But you can be evangelistic and faithful in these ways.
Yes. Well, I think that's a fascinating point, and it's something I'm actually, you very nearly just pushed my button there, right? Because the nexus between effective evangelism and church life, and when I say church life, I mean a community life that is cheerfully intentional in its relationship building and its commitment to worship the living God. But how evangelism plays into that is critically important. I think the picture you gave, I didn't realize you just didn't tell me off air about that conversation with your neighbor, but I'm delighted because I think that's a model example of how to build relationships for the long term. It's like a kind of long-term approach to evangelism. Yes. This guy's going to be living across the street from you or next door to you for, who knows, at least months, hopefully years or decades. If you were in a taxi with a guy that you're probably never going to see again, you might as well throw the book at him and say, you know, if the subject of, hey, where have you been today? Oh, I've been at church. Hey, are you a Christian? You might as well just raise the subject but in many of our contexts, in the workplace, in our neighborhoods where we live, with family members who aren't Christians, we can play the long game, so to speak. And that's where our church community becomes such a valuable evangelistic tool, to the extent that it's a godly church community. Right. Because you bring people into the church community. I used to say to people in London, don't come to church if you don't want to. Just come at 11:15, which is when our service ended. Come at 11:15, and you have some coffee with us, and I'll introduce you to some people, and see if you like us. If you don't, that's fine. Don't come. But we'd have people who come after worship and have coffee and then have lunch with us. And the goal was to welcome them into our community. Now, evangelistically, that's highly effective. Right. It's effective in contexts, particularly where people have had what they regard as a negative experience of church in the past, and perhaps rightly, perhaps wrongly, but they've got some kind of justified or unjustified chip on their shoulder that we need to clear off. We need to be the kind of community that they'd want to be a part of. And again, it's the right kind of realized eschatology. So we are striving to be, and we are, by God's grace, a manifestation of precisely the kingdom that we pray for. Right. Yeah. Nate Douglas, we've taken a lot of your time. I'm grateful for it. Any final thoughts for us about your life as a Christian, a family man? You're a deacon. We've not really talked about that. Maybe we'll talk about that another time. Any final exhortations for the congregation here at All Saints?
Yeah, I would say don't be discouraged, especially for a lot of our younger families, ones with younger children. It's easy to say this too shall pass when you're in a trench and you feel like bullets are constantly whizzing above your head. And you'd never know when an RPG is gonna, or not an RPG,
Something.
one of those weapons of World War I or II, where you don't know when a shell's gonna drop in your trench and just everything's gonna explode and be a giant mess. But be faithful in the little things. As your children are restless during worship, if you need to take them out and take care of something, that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, they're going to make their congregational noises and all of that, but be motivated to get right back in there and get back in the pew and get back to worship as quickly as possible. It's a lot of the habits and training that you are doing at a younger age does have an effect down the road as far as setting expectations. So if you are constantly trying to make a situation easier or not take a scenario where the easy way out is to just stop participating in the thing altogether, they're going to be used to that and they're going to be doing that for the rest of their lives. So be faithful, understand it's work, but we're called to be parents in this current season, and 99% of the time that's just dying of self and sacrificing. So make sure you keep that in mind. For the husbands, make sure you're sacrificing for your wives as much as possible. If it doesn't hurt you a little bit, it's not a sacrifice.
Right.
So
if it hasn't cost you, how could it be a sacrifice?
So that's what our husbands are called to do. So especially in light of Mother's Day, but every day, make sure you're doing that for our wives. That's something that I constantly need to be working on. I'm looking forward to the upcoming men's discipleship meetings on those topics, a lot of other different ways we can take these conversations.
Right. Nate Douglas, thank you very much.
Thank
Friends
you.
of All Saints, the Lord bless you, and bye for now.